So now again, to talk a bit more about TikTok and the direction that it potentially is going to be taking, I want to bring into the conversation Adam Kovacevich. He's the Chamber of Progress CEO. Thanks so much for being with us here on the Live Now from Fox. Of course, we talked to you here on the program before about TikTok before the last ban almost went into effect. But now again, facing that Saturday deadline, initially, what should we be looking out for in the next couple of days?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that this deadline of Saturday is completely artificial. The law that Congress passed requiring TikTok to be sold to a U.S. owner technically went into effect about 75 days ago, but President Trump suspended enforcement of it until this Saturday. Did he have the authority to do that? No, not really, but Trump has kind of broken the longstanding norm that the Justice Department will enforce even laws that the president disagrees with. So Trump just directed his Justice Department not to enforce this law. So to be honest, if there is no sale brokered before Saturday, I would expect Trump to once again suspend enforcement of the law. He did this. He extended this to 75 days ostensibly to try to broker some kind of deal, but it's always been kind of a fake deadline. He could always just keep directing his Justice Department not to enforce the law through the rest of his term if he wanted to.
Is this why is this part of the political hurdles that there are to go to go past in order to get this to be sold? As we just heard there from Richard in the story, just giving us a bit more background, Congress at this point still opposes TikTok and says that it is a national security risk. That also plays into effect here.
That's absolutely right. I mean, this is such a unique situation because we've never before had one of our most popular apps or social networks in this country owned by a Chinese company, and all Chinese companies are obligated to advance the interests of the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party. I think the more reasons why this is complicated is you have a majority of members of Congress concerned about TikTok's Chinese ownership. But you also have Trump, who, used to be anti-TikTok, flip-flopped on TikTok after the company kind of went in big to support him last year. On top of that, the Chinese government really doesn't want TikTok to be sold, which has always been, to me, kind of a sign that they do view TikTok as a national security asset. And I would say the last complication, of course, sort of the obvious one, is that there's millions of people, Americans, who use TikTok who understandably don't want to see the service disrupted. So I think all of those factors are in conflict with one another.
And we do know that Amazon has thrown their hat into the proverbial ring as far as to be one of the new owners of the app. What do you think about them trying to do this? Do you think that this was a smart move on their side? They just mentioned that it could be one of their final stones, as if they have an infinity gauntlet like they're in the Marvel series.
Right. Well, look, honestly, you've seen a bunch of companies throw bids in for TikTok, right? There's an honest question about who, if you're going to have a sort of unique situation where you have Trump trying to broker a sale, why wouldn't you throw in a bid? And certainly, Amazon could afford to do it. I think that the bidders are less important than kind of the key question is of control, ownership, and control over the algorithm, right? Because the big thing here is the Chinese government has to agree to this, right? And to do so would probably involve losing face in China, which they're sort of reluctant to do. But the reporting I've seen about this likely deal, suggests that any deal here would shrink Chinese ownership of TikTok to under 20%, which would meet one part of the law's requirements. So you'd have the app majority owned by American investors. But the reporting has also suggested that the app would continue to use TikTok's algorithm, that ByteDance, Chinese company, would continue to own it and lease it back to the new TikTok America entity, regardless of who that is. That pretty clearly would violate the part of the law that says the algorithm can't remain under Chinese control. Of course, if Trump's Justice Department isn't going to enforce the law anyway, maybe that's a problem for another day. This also leaves unresolved the questions of who's going to actually be running this app and this company under this plan. So there's still a lot we don't know.
I'm glad you brought up China and that element of it. Of course, we also know that Trump this week did levy pretty heavy taxes there on China as well, and tariffs, I should say, specifically. So when we're talking about TikTok and whether or not that can play into it, it's also been said he sort of bantered. This was back in March. He said he would consider lowering tariffs on Chinese goods if the country's government approved the sale of the TikTok operations here in the United States. What's the likelihood of this happening? Do you think this is a potential step that the company might take?
Well, look, this sort of, to me, points out kind of the incoherence of Trump's tariff policy and the degree to which he's freelancing, right? I mean, he said that he was placing tariffs on China to try to stop fentanyl from reaching the United States, right? Now he's saying, well, maybe I'll do a deal in exchange for TikTok. It kind of shows how incoherent his strategy is, right? And so, what is he really negotiating for? I think the idea that we have these big, complicated multilateral issues over trade. I don't really understand why he would spend capital trying to save TikTok there. So, this is. I think as I said, the whole thing is moot unless China allows a sale. They've been adamant against that. I think it would play poorly for them. And look, during Trump's first term, you saw the Chinese government bite dance. They kind of played rope-a-dope with Trump over TikTok. They proposed all these alternatives. They kind of ran out the clock. That may be what they're trying to do again here.
And let's just be, again, pretty frank here as this deadline is approaching. You've already said you don't think it's kind of arbitrary at this point. It may not mean anything ultimately, but there are millions of content creators there on the app who rely on TikTok for their money to pay their rent, to buy groceries in this economy. What should they be looking out for in the next few days as we're getting closer and closer to that deadline of Saturday?
Well, I think one of the things we saw back in January when it looked like the app might be banned and briefly did go down is you started to see many creators starting to diversify. So you saw some creators cross-posting to YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels. And in countries like India that have already banned TikTok a long time ago, people basically migrated over to those two services pretty easily. So, TikTok's a great service. The problem is its ownership. It's not the service itself. But, I think that if I would be willing to bet that you're going to continue to see creators diversifying their presence just because the future of this app is so uncertain.
And Adam, I just want to, again, we've been breaking down the very latest as it pertains to TikTok. Any final thoughts before I let you go here?
No, I think, look, this is, I think one of the things interesting also about the trade dimension of this is that China has actually been blocking our services there for years, right? And so, in some ways, forcing the sale continue operating here is treating Chinese services the same way China treats our services, right? We already have that precedent and so, if we don't kind of behave the same in return, that could be kind of marking us as chumps. So I think that's another dimension to kind of the way this plays into the bilateral relationship between us and China.
And it will be something we certainly continue to follow here on Live Now from Fox. We appreciate you, Adam Kovacevich, there, the Chamber of Progress CEO, helping us to break down the very latest as it pertains to TikTok.
Thank you.
All right.